The ancient bells of St. Bartholomew's had been calling the faithful to worship for nearly 5 centuries, their bronze voices carrying across the rolling countryside of Little Wickham with the same steady rhythm that had marked countless seasons of joy and sorrow. On this particular September evening, as golden light slanted through stained glass windows and cast jeweled patterns across worn flagstones, the church seemed especially peaceful, a sanctuary where time moved at the gentle pace of prayer books and polished pews. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary place, 3rd row from the back on the left side, her knitting bag settled beside her and her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar scene with quiet satisfaction. The evening's harvest festival service had concluded with particular beauty, thanks largely to the exceptional performance of the church choir under the formidable direction of Mrs. Eleanor Croft. The choir mistress, a woman of imposing stature and even more imposing musical standards, had coaxed from her singers a rendition of "For the Beauty of the Earth" that had brought tears to many eyes and a flush of pride to her own stern features. Now, as the congregation lingered for the traditional harvest tea in the parish hall, Miss Marple found herself observing the subtle currents that ran beneath the surface of village harmony. There was young Timothy Fletcher, newest addition to the tenor section, whose voice had cracked slightly during the anthem and who now avoided Mrs. Croft's penetrating gaze. Near the refreshment table, Mrs. Weatherby chatted with determined cheerfulness, though her smile seemed strained after what had clearly been a difficult rehearsal period. Even Dr. Haydock, usually the picture of unflappable composure, seemed unusually fidgety as he balanced his teacup with hands that trembled just slightly. Miss Marple's attention was particularly drawn to the way certain glances were exchanged, or pointedly avoided. She noticed how Clara Finch, the vicar's niece, colored prettily when Timothy Fletcher approached, and how Mrs. Croft's sharp eyes followed this interaction with what could only be described as disapproval. There was something in the choir mistress's rigid posture, in the way she held her teacup like a weapon, that suggested all was not harmonious in the normally well-ordered world of St. Bartholomew's choir. The parish hall hummed with the gentle murmur of village conversation, punctuated by the clink of china and the rustle of best Sunday clothes. The scent of chrysanthemums mingled with that of fresh scones and Earl Grey tea, creating an atmosphere of comfortable domesticity that had remained unchanged for generations. Yet Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked a delicate lace pattern, sensed an undercurrent of tension that seemed at odds with the festive occasion. "Magnificent performance this evening, Mrs. Croft," Colonel Bantry was saying, his military bearing evident even in casual conversation. "Haven't heard the choir sound so fine in years." Mrs. Croft accepted the compliment with a tight-lipped smile that barely softened her stern features. "Standards must be maintained, Colonel. Excellence requires discipline." Her gaze swept over her choir members with the precision of a general reviewing troops, and Miss Marple noticed how several of them seemed to shrink slightly under that penetrating stare. It was then that Mrs. Croft announced, with characteristic authority, that she needed to retrieve some forgotten sheet music from the church vestry. "There are corrections to be made for next week's practice," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. Certain members of the bass section were rather less than perfect in their execution of the final crescendo. A ripple of barely suppressed amusement went through the nearby tables. Mrs. Croft's exacting standards were legendary, as were her pointed critiques. Miss Marple watched as the choir mistress gathered her things with brisk efficiency, her movements betraying perhaps the slightest hint of agitation. As Mrs. Croft headed toward the doors leading back into the church, Miss Marple found herself noting small details that others might overlook. The way the woman's usually steady hands fumbled briefly with her handbag clasp, the tightness around her eyes that suggested more than mere fatigue from the evening's performance. Several minutes passed in comfortable village chatter before young Daisy Henderson, one of the junior choristers, was dispatched by her mother to ask Mrs. Croft about a missing hymn book. The child skipped off toward the church with the careless confidence of youth, her footsteps echoing briefly in the stone corridor that connected the hall to the ancient nave. The scream that shattered the peaceful evening air was like nothing Miss Marple had ever heard, a sound of such pure terror and anguish that it seemed to echo from the very stones of the building itself. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Teacups froze halfway to lips, and every face turned toward the church entrance where Daisy reappeared, her small face white with shock, her eyes wide with an incomprehension that spoke of innocence confronted with something far beyond her young understanding. "Mrs. Croft," the child stammered, her voice barely a whisper that somehow carried clearly in the sudden, absolute silence. She's fallen. By the bell tower steps. There's so much red." The gentle hum of the harvest festival tea dissolved into chaos as villagers rushed toward the church. Dr. Haydock was among the first to respond, his medical training overriding all other considerations as he hurried through the connecting doors. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her mind already working with the careful precision that had served her so well in the past, noting who pushed forward eagerly and who seemed to hang back, who appeared genuinely shocked, and who might be putting on a performance. Inside the church, the warm glow of the evening service had given way to shadows that seemed suddenly ominous. There, at the base of the narrow stone steps leading up to the bell tower, lay Mrs. Eleanor Croft, her silver hair disheveled, her conductor's baton lying broken beside her still form. The ancient flagstones beneath her head bore a dark stain that spoke eloquently of violence, while her music scores lay scattered like fallen leaves around her body. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the fallen choir mistress, his examination swift but thorough. After what seemed an eternity but was probably no more than a minute, he looked up at the growing crowd of villagers with grave eyes. "I'm afraid she's dead," he announced quietly. "It appears she fell and struck her head on the stone steps." But even as the doctor spoke, Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the careful attention that had become second nature to her. Something about the way Mrs. Croft lay, the scattered music, the positioning of that broken baton. It all seemed somehow wrong, like a picture that had been carefully arranged but with one crucial detail out of place. The woman's face, visible in the flickering candlelight, bore an expression of surprise rather than the peaceful acceptance one might expect from someone who had simply lost her footing. As the villagers whispered among themselves in hushed, horrified tones, Miss Marple's keen eyes continued their quiet work. She noticed the way certain people positioned themselves in the crowd, who chose to stand close to the body and who preferred to keep their distance. She observed the tremor in Timothy Fletcher's hands, the pallor of Clara Finch's complexion, the way Dr. Haydock's usually steady voice had developed a slight quaver. Most intriguingly, she noticed something that the others, in their shock and distress, had overlooked entirely. A single chrysanthemum petal, bright yellow against the dark stone, lying several feet from where such a flower had any business being. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that in matters of life and death, the smallest details often proved to be the most significant. The bells of St. Bartholomew's, which had rung so joyfully for the harvest service, now stood silent in their tower above, as if even they understood that something had gone very wrong indeed in the peaceful village of Little Wickham. And Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, with her knitting bag clutched in her gentle hands, began the careful process of observation and deduction that would, in time, reveal the truth behind what had happened beneath those ancient choir bells. The moments following young Daisy's terrible discovery seemed to stretch like pulled taffy, each second weighted with the collective shock of a community confronting the unthinkable. Reverend Clement appeared first, his clerical collar askew and his usually serene face pale with distress as he took in the scene at the base of the bell tower steps. Behind him came others. Colonel Bantry, with his military bearing intact despite the circumstances, Mrs. Weatherby clutching her handkerchief, and Timothy Fletcher, who had returned from telephoning the police with a grim expression that seemed to age him beyond his years. Dr. Haydock worked with quiet efficiency, his examination thorough despite the obvious conclusion. "Inspector Craddock is on his way from Much Benham," Timothy reported, his voice carefully controlled. "He should be here within the hour." The young man's eyes kept drifting toward Clara Finch, who stood pressed against the north wall as if seeking support from the ancient stones themselves. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the tragic scene and the reactions of those around her. Her knitting emerged from her bag with practiced ease, the gentle click of needles providing a comforting rhythm that masked the intensity of her scrutiny. She watched as Colonel Bantry took charge of crowd control with military precision, noting how certain individuals seemed eager to help, while others hung back with expressions of barely concealed anxiety. Tragic accident, of course. Mrs. Weatherby declared to anyone within hearing distance, her voice pitched with the particular authority of someone establishing the official narrative. "Those steps have been dangerous for years. I told the church council only last month that someone would take a tumble eventually." Yet Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Weatherby had navigated those same steps countless times without incident, and had never mentioned their supposed treachery until this moment. The arrival of Inspector Craddock brought with it the reassuring weight of official procedure. A man of middle years with sharp eyes and a methodical approach, he conducted his preliminary examination with a thoroughness that had earned him his reputation. "Appears to be a straightforward case of accidental death," he announced after consulting with Dr. Haydock. "Poor woman lost her footing, struck her head on the flagstones. Tragic, but these old buildings can be treacherous, especially in dim light." Yet as the inspector spoke, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Haydock's slight hesitation, a barely perceptible pause that suggested the medical man found something not quite as straightforward as it appeared. She filed this observation away with the growing collection of small details that seemed somehow significant. The scattered sheet music that had drifted far beyond where a simple fall would have carried it. The broken conductor's baton lying with suspicious neatness, and most particularly, that yellow chrysanthemum petal that had no business being near the bell tower steps. As the official investigation proceeded, the villagers gradually dispersed, carrying their shock and speculation into the network of conversations that would soon spread throughout Little Wickham. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to assist with tidying up after the disrupted harvest tea, but actually to conduct her own quiet examination of both the scene and the people involved. The Spotted Cow, the village's primary gathering place for informal discussion, became the natural center for speculation that evening. Timothy Fletcher, perhaps emboldened by the gravity of the situation, voiced doubts that others had been thinking but hadn't dared express. "Mrs. Croft wasn't the type to make careless mistakes," he said to Clara, who listened with wide, troubled eyes. "She knew every stone in that church, every step of those stairs. She'd climbed them hundreds of times." At the vicarage, Reverend Clement struggled with his own conflicted feelings about his demanding choir mistress. "She was devoted to excellence," he told his niece Clara when she returned home, pale and shaken. "Perhaps too devoted at times. She could be difficult with people who didn't share her standards." The admission seemed to pain him, as if speaking honestly about the dead was somehow a betrayal of his calling. Meanwhile, in her comfortable sitting room, Miss Marple worked steadily at her knitting while her mind processed the evening's events with the methodical precision of a well-tuned instrument. She thought about Mrs. Croft's agitated behavior before her death, the way the woman had fumbled with her handbag clasp, the tightness around her eyes that had suggested more than mere fatigue. The choir mistress had claimed to be retrieving forgotten sheet music, yet the scattered papers at the scene were for next Sunday's anthem, music the choir had been rehearsing for weeks and which required no corrections. The next morning brought renewed activity as Inspector Craddock returned with a photographer and additional personnel to complete his investigation. The church, so recently filled with joyful harvest hymns, now echoed with the clinical sounds of official procedure. Flash bulbs captured the tragic tableau from every angle. Measurements were taken, and statements were collected from everyone who had been present at the harvest evensong. Miss Marple, observing from her garden where she tended her late-blooming roses, noted the various comings and goings with interest. She watched Timothy Fletcher emerge from the church looking even more troubled than before, his hands thrust deep into his pockets in a gesture that suggested he was struggling to control their trembling. Clara Finch appeared shortly after, her prayer book clutched tightly against her chest as if it might provide protection against the terrible events that had shattered the peace of their small community. Most intriguing was the behavior of Mr. Pemberton, the church treasurer, who seemed unusually agitated for a man normally so retiring. He practically disappeared into the background. Miss Marple observed him pacing near the church gates with quick, nervous steps, his usually neat appearance disheveled and his face bearing an expression of what could only be described as barely controlled panic. As the official investigation drew to its predictable conclusion, accidental death by misadventure, Miss Marple found herself returning to that single yellow chrysanthemum petal. Such a small thing, perhaps meaningless to others, but she had learned long ago that in matters of life and death, the smallest details often prove to be the most significant. The harvest decorations had been carefully arranged by Mrs. Hartley from the Women's Institute, positioned nowhere near the bell tower steps. Yet somehow a petal had found its way there, as if carried on someone's shoe or clothing. The village, eager to return to its normal rhythms, seemed ready to accept the official verdict and put the tragedy behind them. But Miss Marple, settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the afternoon light slanted through her lace curtains, knew that the truth was rarely so accommodating. Mrs. Eleanor Croft had been many things: demanding, perfectionist, sometimes cruel in her pursuit of musical excellence. But she had not been careless. And in Miss Marple's long experience, people who were never careless rarely died by accident, especially when yellow chrysanthemum petals appeared where they had no business being. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a counterpoint to her thoughts as she began the patient process of unraveling the human threads that had led to death beneath the choir bells of St. Bartholomew's. In the distance, those same bells remained silent in their tower, as if they too understood that their song would not ring pure again until the truth had been revealed. The morning after Mrs. Croft's tragic death brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when tragedy disrupts the natural order of things. Little Wickham hummed with subdued conversation, the kind of whispered speculation that spreads through a community like ripples on a pond. Miss Marple, making her customary morning rounds with shopping basket in hand, found herself privy to a dozen different theories about the choir mistress's demise, each delivered with the particular authority that comes from having an opinion about matters beyond one's direct knowledge. At Mullin's grocery, Mrs. Price held court near the tinned goods, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had appointed herself the village's primary source of information. "Mark my words," she declared to her captive audience. "There was more to Eleanor Croft than met the eye. A woman doesn't reach her age without making enemies, especially not one with her sharp tongue and impossible standards." The murmurs of agreement that followed suggested that Mrs. Croft's demanding nature had indeed left its mark on the community, though Miss Marple noted how quickly the conversation shifted when certain names were mentioned. The post office provided another venue for observation, where Mrs. Dane, the postmistress, confided in hushed tones about Mrs. Croft's recent behavior. Quite agitated she'd been these past few weeks, Mrs. Dane whispered, glancing around despite their privacy. "Came in to post a registered letter to London just last Tuesday. Wouldn't say what it was about, but her hands were shaking something dreadful. Not like her at all. Mrs. Croft was always steady as a rock." This revelation about correspondence with London struck Miss Marple as potentially significant. Mrs. Croft had not been the type of woman whose hands would shake without considerable cause, and the timing of this mysterious letter seemed worth investigating further. Miss Marple filed this information away with her growing collection of curious details, her mind already beginning to weave connections between seemingly disparate threads. Her next stop brought her to Mr. Pemberton's modest cottage, where she had arranged to discuss a small matter regarding the church restoration fund. The church treasurer, normally a man of meticulous habits and precise demeanor, appeared distinctly disheveled when he answered the door. His usually neat appearance was in disarray, his hair uncombed and his collar askew in a way that suggested considerable agitation. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," he said, though his smile seemed forced and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "The Restoration Fund, yes, of course. Though with poor Mrs. Croft gone, there are so many matters to sort through. She was very particular about the accounts, very thorough in her oversight." His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers on his desk, and Miss Marple noticed a document marked "Bell Rope Replacement, Disbursement Pending," with figures that appeared to have been erased and rewritten. "She did take such care with church matters," Miss Marple agreed gently, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. "I imagine her attention to detail was quite valuable, though perhaps sometimes challenging for those who worked with her." Mr. Pemberton's flush deepened, and he hastily gathered the papers, but not before Miss Marple glimpsed what appeared to be significant discrepancies in the amounts listed. From Mr. Pemberton's cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Clara Finch in the garden, tending to the late chrysanthemums with unusual intensity. The young woman's face bore traces of the previous evening's shock, but there was something else in her expression, a kind of troubled preoccupation that went beyond simple grief for the deceased choir mistress. "Such beautiful flowers," Miss Marple observed, admiring the golden blooms. "I noticed a stray petal near the church yesterday, quite out of place among the harvest decorations." Clara's hands stilled on the flower stems, and a faint color rose in her cheeks. "Mrs. Hartley's arrangements do tend to scatter," Clara replied carefully, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested the observation had struck home. "The wind, you know, and people brushing past." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Fletcher, who approached with the particular urgency of youth confronting crisis. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and his eyes held a desperate energy that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. "Miss Marple, Clara," he said breathlessly, "I've been thinking about Mrs. Croft's death, and there are things that simply don't make sense. Things the police haven't considered." He paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing. "Mrs. Croft was terrified of heights. She told me so herself when I offered to help retrieve some music from the bell tower storage last month. She wouldn't even climb a step ladder without someone to steady it." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A woman with such a pronounced fear would hardly venture up those narrow, winding stone steps alone, especially in the dim light of evening. Yet the official investigation had concluded that Mrs. Croft had done exactly that, presumably to retrieve the sheet music she claimed to have forgotten. Clara's reaction to Timothy's words was equally telling. A quick intake of breath, followed by a glance toward the vicarage that suggested she was weighing whether to speak. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "There's something else," she said quietly. "I saw Mrs. Croft drop a paper from her handbag last night before the service. When she bent to retrieve it, I glimpsed part of a line, after evensong by the... before she tucked it away. I assumed it was about choir practice, but now..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Mrs. Croft had arranged to meet someone after the service, and that meeting had taken place near the bell tower steps. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, connecting this new information with her other observations. The mysterious note, the unlocked tower door that should have been secured, the scattered chrysanthemum petals, and now the revelation about Mrs. Croft's fear of heights, all pointed toward a deliberate deception rather than a tragic accident. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church, where Amos Reed, the verger, was methodically cleaning up the remaining harvest decorations. The old man worked with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty, his weathered hands gentle with the wilted flowers and faded greenery. "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple observed, settling onto a pew where she could watch both Amos and the area near the bell tower steps. "I understand the tower door was found unlocked after the tragedy. Most unusual, I should think." Amos paused in his work, his face troubled. "Aye, that's what bothers me most. I checked that door myself before the service. Locked tight as always. We never leave it open, not unless the bells need tending. But when the inspector went to look, there it was, standing ajar." He held up his right hand, which bore a fresh bandage around one finger. "Caught it on the hinge earlier. Clumsy of me. But those hinges don't swing by themselves, Miss Marple. Someone opened that door from the inside." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind turned over the various threads she had gathered throughout the day. The financial irregularities that had clearly been troubling Mr. Pemberton, the mysterious registered letter to London, Clara's knowledge of Mrs. Croft's arranged meeting, Timothy's revelation about the choir mistress's fear of heights, and the evidence that someone had unlocked the tower door from within, all suggested a carefully orchestrated deception. Most intriguingly, there remained the matter of that yellow chrysanthemum petal, found where no such flower had any business being. Miss Marple had observed the way Clara had reacted to her casual mention of it, the flush that had colored the young woman's cheeks, and the careful way she had deflected the observation. Someone had been near those bell tower steps with chrysanthemum petals on their person, and that someone might well hold the key to understanding what had really happened to Mrs. Eleanor Croft. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the afternoon light faded, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that in a village where everyone supposedly knew everyone else's business, Mrs. Croft's death had revealed how many secrets still lay hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly transparent community. The challenge now would be to uncover those secrets before they could do further harm, for in her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that murder, once committed, had a tendency to breed more violence in its wake. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as she began to formulate her next steps. Tomorrow would bring opportunities for more subtle questioning, more careful observation, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, the first clear note of discord that would help her unravel the complex human symphony that had led to death beneath the choir bells of St. Bartholomew's. The following morning brought with it the kind of deliberate quietude that settles over a village when tragedy has disrupted the natural order of things. Miss Marple, rising early as was her custom, observed from her bedroom window that several houses which normally bustled with morning activity remained shuttered, as if their occupants were reluctant to face another day in a world suddenly made uncertain. She began her day with the methodical approach that had served her so well in the past, understanding that in matters of life and death, patience and careful observation often revealed more than urgent questioning. Her first destination was Dr. Haydock's surgery, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening catalogue, though her true purpose was to explore the medical man's obvious discomfort with the official verdict. She found him in his consulting room, staring pensively out the window with the expression of someone wrestling with professional conscience. "You are not entirely comfortable with Inspector Craddock's conclusion," Miss Marple observed mildly, settling into the chair where she could see his face clearly. "Not from the first, if I may say so." Dr. Haydock hesitated, then sighed deeply. "I dislike arguing with Scotland Yard, Miss Marple, and I dislike even more discussing a patient outside proper channels." He rubbed his temple with evident frustration. "But since you ask, I will say this much. The injury that killed Mrs. Croft was a single, decisive blow to the right temple. There were minor abrasions, yes, but I should have expected more from someone tumbling down stone steps, scrapes to hands and knees, for instance. Hers were curiously unmarked." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "And there was an odd pressure bruise about the left wrist, as if someone had gripped her very hard, briefly." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. An unmarked fall suggested either sudden unconsciousness or deliberate positioning, neither of which supported the accident theory. She thanked Dr. Haydock for his candor and made her way to the church, where she found Amos Reed methodically cleaning the brass candlesticks, with his characteristic reverence for every detail. "Mrs. Croft's baton was found by the tower steps, you know," Miss Marple remarked casually as she admired his work. "Such a pity to see it broken." Amos paused, his weathered brow furrowing with confusion. "Funny you should say that, Miss Marple. I saw that baton myself after service, right in the oak stand in the choir stalls where she always put it. I snuffed the altar candles and then the others. The thing was right there in its groove like always." He gave her a doubtful glance. How it came to be by the tower later, well, I couldn't rightly say. The implications were clear to Miss Marple. A baton moved after the fact suggested deliberate staging, someone wanting it to appear that Mrs. Croft had carried it with her to the tower. This was orchestration, not accident, and it spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Fletcher, who approached with the particular urgency of youth confronting moral crisis. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and his eyes held a desperate energy that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "I didn't tell the inspector everything yesterday. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, or myself." He swallowed hard before continuing. "I went toward the tower after the service to tell Mrs. Croft I was leaving the choir. She'd said things about Clara that were unkind. I heard voices before I reached the steps, hers sharp as ever, and a man's low and angry. I couldn't make out words, but they were clearly arguing. I didn't stay. I ran back to the hall." His voice cracked slightly. "If I'd gone on, if I'd intervened somehow." Miss Marple touched his sleeve gently. "Running away is a common human reaction, my dear. What matters now is that you heard two voices, which narrows things considerably. It's always useful to know whether someone was arguing with the air or not." As Timothy departed with the resolve of someone walking toward necessary pain, Miss Marple reflected on how this testimony changed everything. Mrs. Croft had indeed met someone by the tower steps, and that meeting had involved heated argument. The question now was identifying the owner of that angry male voice. The afternoon brought renewed speculation throughout the village, much of it centering on Mr. Pemberton and the financial irregularities that had come to light. Mrs. Weatherby, encountered outside the post office, was particularly vocal in her theories. Poor Mrs. Croft had been investigating discrepancies in the church accounts for weeks, she confided, her voice carrying the authority of someone privy to important information. She'd scheduled a meeting with the church council for Tuesday, something about financial matters that required immediate attention. She'd been carrying around a folder of documents, guarding them like state secrets. This information provided a clear motive for murder, and Miss Marple noted how readily the village embraced it. Mr. Pemberton, with his nervous disposition and obvious distress, made a convenient target for suspicion. When Inspector Craddock was seen emerging from the treasurer's cottage that afternoon, looking grimly satisfied, the village gossips seized upon it as confirmation of their theories. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of the obvious solution. While Mr. Pemberton certainly had motive and opportunity, several details continued to trouble her. There was still the matter of that yellow chrysanthemum petal, found where no such flower had any business being. During her visit to the vicarage that evening, she observed Clara tending the garden chrysanthemums with particular intensity, her movements careful and controlled as she gathered the spent blooms. "Such beautiful flowers," Miss Marple observed, noting how Clara's hands stilled on the stems. "I noticed a stray petal near the church yesterday, quite out of place among the harvest decorations." Clara's flush was immediate and telling. "Mrs. Hartley's arrangements do tend to scatter," she replied carefully, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested the observation had struck home. "The wind, you know, and people brushing past." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind worked to connect the various threads she had gathered. The medical evidence suggested deliberate violence rather than accident. The moved baton indicated careful staging. Timothy's testimony confirmed a heated argument between Mrs. Croft and an unknown man. The financial motive provided by Mrs. Weatherby seemed almost too convenient, too perfectly timed to deflect suspicion from other possibilities. Most intriguingly, there remained Clara's obvious knowledge of details she shouldn't possess, her nervous reactions to casual questions, and the persistent mystery of that chrysanthemum petal. Miss Marple had learned long ago that in matters of murder, the most obvious suspect was often precisely that. Too obvious to be true. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to arrange Mrs. Croft's death to look like an accident, and when that failed, to ensure suspicion fell on Mr. Pemberton. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that Mrs. Croft's death seemed to have provided convenient solutions to several different problems simultaneously. The financial investigation would be abandoned, romantic tensions in the choir would no longer face disapproving oversight, and various personal secrets would remain safely buried. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that such convenient coincidences were rarely coincidental at all. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing rhythm as she began to formulate her next steps. Tomorrow would bring opportunities for more careful observation, more subtle questioning, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, the first clear indication of who had really been arguing with Mrs. Croft beneath the choir bells of St. Bartholomew's. The truth, she was certain, lay not in the obvious financial motive that had so captured Inspector Craddock's attention, but in the smaller, more personal secrets that festered beneath the surface of their seemingly transparent village community. The morning after her evening contemplations brought Miss Marple a renewed sense of purpose, though she maintained the unhurried pace that had served her so well in previous investigations. Her first destination was the post office, where Mrs. Dane's natural tendency toward helpful gossip could be channeled into more productive directions. The postmistress, still troubled by the previous day's events, proved eager to share additional details about Mrs. Croft's recent correspondence. "There was more to that registered letter than I mentioned yesterday," Mrs. Dane confided, glancing around despite their privacy. It was addressed to Langstone and Archer, solicitors, Lincoln's Inn, and Mrs. Croft had written "Choir Trust, Urgent" on the declaration slip. She lowered her voice further. "And there was a telegram that came for her yesterday afternoon, too late to deliver before evensong, from Mr. Langstone himself saying, 'Received. Please telephone at earliest convenience. Matter pressing.' I took it to the vicarage after everything happened." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A choir trust suggested financial arrangements far more complex than the simple church accounts Mr. Pemberton managed. If Mrs. Croft had been involved in establishing or administering such a trust, her death might have implications beyond the immediate tragedy. More importantly, if the London solicitors had received her documents, removing Mrs. Croft would not stop their investigation. It would merely delay and complicate it. Her next visit took her to Mrs. Croft's cottage, where she had arranged to meet Reverend Clement and Clara to select appropriate music for a memorial service. The choir mistress's home reflected her personality perfectly, precise, austere, and uncompromising in its orderliness. Yet Miss Marple's trained eye noticed details that spoke of recent disturbance. A vase of yellow chrysanthemums on the mantelpiece, identical to those in the vicarage garden, with several petals scattered on the polished wood beneath. More significantly, while ostensibly tidying a few crumbs of candle wax from the escritoire, Miss Marple discovered a torn scrap of paper caught beneath the blotter. The fragment read, "Evensong by the West Stair. Come alone." The handwriting was printed in careful block letters, the kind of disguise that people employed when they wished to conceal their natural hand. though Miss Marple had learned that such attempts often revealed more than they concealed about the writer's true identity. "Inspector Craddock will want to see that," Reverend Clement observed, when she drew his attention to the fragment, his voice carrying the particular unease of a man whose peaceful parish had become the scene of criminal investigation. As they worked through Mrs. Croft's papers, Miss Marple became aware of another scent beneath the familiar lavender polish, the warm, lingering smell of pipe tobacco. Mrs. Croft had not been a smoker, and her house bore no other evidence of such indulgences. Yet someone who smoked a pipe had been in this room recently, someone whose tobacco had clung to wool clothing long enough to leave its mark in the still air. Clara worked beside them with careful efficiency, but Miss Marple observed how the young woman's hands trembled slightly when handling Mrs. Croft's personal effects. When Clara bent to retrieve a fallen sheet of music, Miss Marple noticed a thin red line across her wrist, recently healed but still visible. "Garden work can be so hazardous," Miss Marple observed gently. "I'm forever catching myself on thorns and stems." "Yes," Clara replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The roses by the vicarage gate are particularly troublesome. Uncle wanted some cut for the sideboard earlier this week." It was a reasonable explanation, though Miss Marple noted that chrysanthemums, unlike roses, rarely produced such scratches. The mark looked more like the result of a firm grip than a gardening accident, and its placement on Clara's wrist corresponded exactly to the pressure bruise Dr. Haydock had mentioned finding on Mrs. Croft's body. Inspector Craddock's arrival brought official attention to their discoveries. The torn note, combined with the telegram from London, seemed to strengthen the case against Mr. Pemberton, and the inspector departed with evident satisfaction to bring the church treasurer in for further questioning. Yet when Mr. Pemberton was interviewed at the station later that day, his confession revealed a man guilty of weakness rather than murder. He admitted to temporary reallocations from the church funds. Not theft, he insisted, but emergency borrowing to cover his young niece's medical expenses in Southampton. Mrs. Croft had discovered the discrepancy and confronted him, but had agreed to give him until Tuesday to restore the funds and confess to the church council himself. She was hard, Mr. Pemberton admitted, his delicate hands clenched together in his lap. Harder than charity requires. But she promised that if I made things right myself, she would say only that I had been careless with the bookkeeping. When pressed about meeting Mrs. Croft after evensong, his face went pale. "She would never have trusted me near the tower," he said simply, and the ring of truth in his voice was unmistakable. While official investigation followed its methodical course, village life continued to provide its own revelations. At the Spotted Cow that evening, Timothy Fletcher's composure finally cracked when Ben Hart, the cold delivery man, made a crude remark about choir boys who court the vicar's good graces and other people's nieces. Timothy's hand shot forward before his mind could stop it, but Clara, who had accompanied her uncle to make flower arrangements with Mrs. Hartley, caught his sleeve and spoke his name with such authority that he stopped immediately. Miss Marple, observing from her corner table, saw something in Clara's face in that moment that went beyond simple concern for Timothy's reputation. There was fear there, not just fear for Timothy, but fear of something that, once unleashed, could not be contained again. Later that evening, as Miss Marple paused to admire the chrysanthemums in the vicarage garden, she engaged Clara in seemingly casual conversation about the flowers. The young woman worked with particular intensity, cutting away spent blooms with movements that were careful and controlled, almost ritualistic in their precision. "Mrs. Hartley mentioned that you had asked for extra chrysanthemums for the vicarage," Miss Marple observed. "Such thoughtful attention to maintaining beautiful arrangements." Clara's flush was immediate and telling. "Uncle appreciates fresh flowers, especially during difficult times like these." But her voice carried a tremor that suggested the observation had struck deeper than intended. Their conversation was interrupted by Reverend Clement's appearance on the step, his unlit pipe held in the absent gesture of a man seeking comfort in familiar rituals. Miss Marple noticed the faintest dusting of yellow pollen on his coat cuff, chrysanthemum pollen, which had a tendency to cling to fabric and transfer readily from person to person or surface to surface. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation was revealing layers of complexity beneath the village's seemingly transparent surface. The financial motive that had so captured Inspector Craddock's attention was proving less compelling than initially believed. Mr. Pemberton, despite his nervous disposition and admitted irregularities, seemed more victim than perpetrator. More intriguing were the personal relationships that had been simmering beneath the surface. Clara's obvious resentment toward Mrs. Croft's interference in her romance with Timothy, the choir mistress's documented threats to speak with Reverend Clement about their unseemly behavior, and the mysterious London correspondence that suggested financial arrangements far more complex than simple church bookkeeping. The physical evidence continued to accumulate as well. The torn note arranging a meeting by the West Stair after evensong, the chrysanthemum petals found where no such flowers had been arranged, the pressure bruise on Mrs. Croft's wrist that matched the scratch on Clara's, and the pipe tobacco scent in a house where no one smoked, all pointed toward careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. Most significantly, Miss Marple had begun to understand that Mrs. Croft's death had provided convenient solutions to several different problems simultaneously. The financial investigation would be abandoned with the treasurer's confession. Romantic tensions in the choir would no longer face disapproving oversight, and various personal secrets would remain safely buried. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that such convenient coincidences were rarely coincidental at all. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple allowed her mind to work through the various threads she had gathered. The truth, she was increasingly certain, lay not in the obvious financial motive that had captured official attention, but in the smaller, more personal secrets that festered beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful community. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to arrange Mrs. Croft's death to look accidental, and when that deception began to unravel, to ensure suspicion fell on the conveniently nervous Mr. Pemberton. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing rhythm as she contemplated her next steps. Tomorrow would bring opportunities for more careful observation, more subtle questioning, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, the moment when someone's carefully maintained composure would finally crack under the weight of accumulated guilt and fear. The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden among the chrysanthemum petals and choir sashes, the registered letters and torn notes, the human hearts that had been pushed beyond their capacity for patience and forgiveness. The following morning brought Miss Marple the kind of revelation that arrives not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details. Her first visitor was Mrs. Hartley from the Women's Institute, who appeared at the garden gate with the particular agitation of someone who has discovered that their careful work has been disturbed in ways they cannot explain. "Miss Marple, I've been going over the harvest decorations in my mind," Mrs. Hartley began without preamble, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded with obvious concern. "I counted every chrysanthemum myself when we arranged them, 36 blooms, all accounted for and placed precisely where they belonged. Not one of them was anywhere near the bell tower steps." She paused, her hands twisting the handle of her shopping basket. "But yesterday, when I went to clear away the wilted ones, I found only 34 blooms remaining. 2 were missing entirely, not just petals scattered by wind or footsteps." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. 2 whole chrysanthemums, carefully removed from the church decorations, suggested deliberate planning rather than accidental transfer. Someone had taken those flowers, knowing they would leave traces, but had proceeded anyway because their plan required it. Her contemplation was interrupted by Inspector Craddock's arrival, looking grimmer than she had seen him since the investigation began. "I've just spoken with Langstone and Archer in London," he announced without preamble. Mrs. Croft had indeed sent them documents regarding something called the St. Bartholomew Choir Development Trust, a bequest made years ago by a Miss Lydia Searle to foster musical promise among parish youth. He consulted his notebook with evident frustration. There are 3 trustees named: Reverend Clement Finch, Mrs. Eleanor Croft, and Dr. Lionel Haydock. Mrs. Croft suspected irregular disbursements and had requested the London solicitors contact the other trustees for clarification. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. A trust fund provided both motive and opportunity for financial irregularity, but more importantly, it suggested that Mrs. Croft's death might have been intended to prevent rather than conceal wrongdoing. If the London solicitors had already received her documents, removing Mrs. Croft would not stop their investigation. It would merely delay and complicate it. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church where she found Amos Reed replacing the broken lock on the bell tower door. The old verger worked with his characteristic attention to detail, but his weathered face bore an expression of troubled concentration that went beyond simple maintenance duties. "Inspector Craddock's orders," Amos explained when she inquired about the new lock. "Though it seems like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, if you'll pardon the expression." He paused in his work, examining the old lock mechanism with professional interest. Funny thing, though. This lock wasn't forced or broken. It was opened with a key. Someone had proper access to that tower. Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. The bell tower was kept locked for safety reasons, with keys held only by the verger, the vicar, and the church treasurer. If the door had been opened with a key rather than forced, it narrowed the circle of possible suspects considerably. As she examined the base of the tower steps once more, Miss Marple's keen eye caught something the others had missed in their initial investigations. On the 3rd step up, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was a faint crescent of beeswax, the kind that accumulated on polished church implements. It was positioned as if something had rested there briefly, not fallen or been hurled, but carefully placed and then removed. The implications were troubling. Amos had clearly remembered seeing Mrs. Croft's conductor's baton in its proper place in the choir stalls after the service, yet it had been found broken beside her body. Someone had retrieved it later, used it as a prop in their carefully staged scene, perhaps even resting it momentarily on that 3rd step before positioning it by the body and breaking it for dramatic effect. Her investigation continued at the vicarage, where she had arranged to help Clara sort through Mrs. Croft's choir music for the memorial service. The young woman worked with careful efficiency, but Miss Marple observed how Clara's hands trembled slightly when handling certain pieces, particularly the anthem sheets that had been scattered around Mrs. Croft's body. Reverend Clement appeared in his study doorway, his unlit pipe clenched between his teeth in the particular way that indicated considerable stress. The familiar scent of pipe tobacco hung faintly in the air, the same sweetish aroma Miss Marple had noticed in Mrs. Croft's cottage, where no one was known to smoke. "I've just returned from the police station," the vicar announced, his usually serene demeanor strained. "Inspector Craddock wanted to discuss the bell tower keys. It seems they're treating Mrs. Croft's death as something more than a simple accident now." He sank into his chair with evident weariness. "They've asked me to account for my keys' whereabouts on the night she died." Miss Marple observed Clara's reaction to this news with particular interest. The young woman's face went pale, and her hands stilled completely on the music she had been sorting. There was fear in her expression, not just concern for her uncle, but the kind of terror that comes from knowing terrible secrets. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that the truth lay not in the obvious financial motive that had initially captured everyone's attention, but in the complex web of personal relationships that surrounded the vicarage. The missing chrysanthemums, the pipe tobacco scent in Mrs. Croft's cottage, the careful staging of the baton, and Clara's obvious distress all pointed toward a more intimate motive for murder. Later that evening, as she settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation was revealing layers of complexity beneath the village's seemingly transparent surface. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make Mrs. Croft's death appear accidental, and when that deception began to unravel, had allowed suspicion to fall conveniently on Mr. Pemberton's financial irregularities. But the physical evidence told a different story, one of careful planning, intimate knowledge of the church's layout and routines, and access to keys that only 3 people in the parish possessed. Most significantly, it spoke of someone who could move through that sacred space without drawing attention, someone whose presence would be unremarkable even in the evening hours after evensong. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as Miss Marple began to understand that Mrs. Croft's death had solved several problems simultaneously. The choir mistress's interference in Clara's romance would cease, her investigation into the choir trust would be abandoned, and various personal secrets would remain safely buried. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that such convenient coincidences were rarely coincidental at all. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for observation and questioning, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, the moment when someone's carefully maintained composure would finally crack under the weight of accumulated guilt and fear. The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden among the chrysanthemum petals and choir music, the registered letters and broken batons, the human hearts that had been pushed beyond their capacity for patience and Christian forgiveness. The following morning brought with it an urgency that seemed to permeate the very stones of St. Bartholomew's. Miss Marple arrived at the church to find Inspector Craddock examining a piece of paper with the concentrated attention of a man who had discovered something significant. Young Daisy Henderson, solemn in her role as discoverer of evidence, stood nearby with her mother, pointing toward the hymn book shelf where Mrs. Croft had always conducted her choir. "Found tucked behind the number boards," Inspector Craddock explained, holding up a folded note. "Block letters, meant to disguise the hand." He showed Miss Marple the message, "Let it be. Accident, God knows." The printing was careful and deliberate, but Miss Marple's trained eye immediately noticed the peculiar characteristics, the way the R extended too far down in a small hook, the G's that were almost completely closed rather than open circles. "Someone hopes we'll accept the official verdict and ask no more questions," Miss Marple observed, studying the handwriting with particular interest. She had seen similar printing recently, though she couldn't immediately place where. The letters had that careful uniformity that came from someone trying very hard to disguise their natural hand. Yet certain habits persisted despite the writer's best efforts. Their examination was interrupted by Amos Reed's urgent shout from the direction of the vestry. They hurried to find the old verger standing before the oak chest where choir supplies were kept, his weathered face grim with distress. The chest's lock had been forced, and Mrs. Croft's small music cabinet showed signs of violent entry. Its drawer splintered, papers scattered across the floor. "Nothing of value in coin," Amos reported, his voice tight with indignation. "But she kept her address book and correspondence notes in that drawer. Wouldn't trust them anywhere else," said the vicarage was too busy with comings and goings. Miss Marple knelt carefully among the scattered debris, her keen eyes noting details that others might overlook. Crushed into the dust and splinters were several bright yellow smears, fresh chrysanthemum pollen that had been ground into the floorboards by someone's shoes. The pollen was still vivid, indicating the break-in had occurred very recently, perhaps even during the night. "Someone wanted those papers very badly," Inspector Craddock observed, surveying the methodical destruction. This wasn't random vandalism. They knew exactly what they were looking for. The investigation continued at Mrs. Croft's cottage, where they discovered the front window had been carefully unlatched from within, the hook not properly caught. Inside, the scene told a similar story of targeted search rather than opportunistic theft. The vase of chrysanthemums that Miss Marple had noticed so carefully arranged on her previous visit now lay overturned on the hearthrug. Water darkening the wool, several stems snapped. Papers had been systematically removed from the escritoire, leaving behind only the faint outline of their former arrangement. As Miss Marple examined the sitting room with her characteristic thoroughness, something glinted near the skirting board. Wrapped carefully in her handkerchief, she retrieved a plain collar stud of the type used with clerical collars, a small but potentially significant piece of evidence that spoke of hasty movement in an unfamiliar space. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Haydock, ostensibly to discuss a minor ailment, but actually to explore his knowledge of the Choir Trust investigation. She found him in his surgery, looking unusually haggard, a stack of medical journals untouched on his desk. Mrs. Croft was quite determined in her investigation, Dr. Haydock confided after Miss Marple's gentle inquiries. She had convinced herself that someone had been, shall we say, overly generous with the trust funds, perhaps to a relative or favored student. She mentioned having uncovered particularly damning evidence, something that would expose the wolf in sheep's clothing, as she put it. He rubbed his temples wearily. She was scheduled to present her complete findings to Langstone and Archer next week. This revelation cast new light on the urgency surrounding Mrs. Croft's death. If she had indeed discovered specific evidence of impropriety, removing her would only delay, not prevent, the eventual exposure. Unless, of course, the evidence itself could be destroyed along with its discoverer. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the vicarage provided further pieces to the increasingly complex puzzle. She found Clara in the garden, tending the late chrysanthemums with movements that seemed almost compulsive in their intensity. The young woman's face bore the strain of recent events, but there was something deeper in her expression, a kind of desperate control that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Such beautiful flowers," Miss Marple observed, noting how several blooms had been recently cut. "I noticed the arrangement in the church had some missing yesterday. Mrs. Hartley was quite concerned about it." Clara's hands stilled on the flower stems, and a flush crept up her neck. "People have been taking flowers for various memorials," she said carefully. "It's natural that some would go missing." As they worked together in the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple gently inquired about the thin red line still visible on Clara's wrist. "Garden work can be so hazardous," she observed. "I hope that scratch isn't troubling you." Clara's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she unconsciously pulled her sleeve down to cover the mark. "It wasn't from gardening," she admitted in a barely audible voice. "It was—" Mrs. Croft grabbed my arm rather forcefully earlier that evening. She was quite agitated about something, more upset than I'd ever seen her. This admission provided crucial confirmation of Dr. Haydock's observation about the pressure bruise on Mrs. Croft's wrist. The two women had been in physical contact shortly before the choir mistress's death, and that contact had been forceful enough to leave marks on both participants. As evening approached, Mrs. Dane from the post office arrived at the vicarage with another unsigned message, this one pushed under the door of the post office during the night. The note, addressed to Inspector Craddock in the same careful block letters, read, "Cease, let her rest. Accident, do not dig." The same distinctive handwriting characteristics were present, the hooked R, the closed G's, and Miss Marple finally remembered where she had seen similar printing. It was on the labels for the children's hymn folders, created just last month with Clara's careful, uniform lettering. The realization struck Miss Marple with the force of certainty. Clara's desperate attempts to end the investigation, combined with her obvious guilt and the physical evidence of her encounter with Mrs. Croft, painted a picture of increasing desperation. Someone was trying very hard to bury the truth, but their very efforts were revealing more than silence would have accomplished. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind worked to connect the final threads of the mystery. The break-ins spoke of someone with intimate knowledge of where Mrs. Croft kept her important papers. The threatening notes revealed a writer whose disguised printing still betrayed familiar characteristics. The physical evidence, the collar stud, the chrysanthemum pollen, the pressure bruises, all pointed towards someone who moved freely through both church and vicarage, someone whose presence would never be questioned in either location. Most significantly, the timing of events suggested not a single moment of violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign to first commit murder, then systematically eliminate all evidence of the crime. The person responsible had access, opportunity, and intimate knowledge of everyone involved, but their very thoroughness was creating a trail that careful observation could follow. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on how close the truth had become. Tomorrow would bring the moment when all the carefully gathered threads would need to be woven together, when someone's desperate attempts to maintain their deception would finally collapse under the weight of accumulated evidence. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in their tower, waiting for the moment when justice would allow them to ring pure and true once more. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as she prepared for what she knew would be the final act in this tragic drama. Human nature, in her long experience, could bear only so much pressure before it cracked, and someone in Little Wickham was very close to that breaking point. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet revelations about Clara's handwriting brought with it the kind of purposeful activity that follows breakthrough moments in complex investigations. Inspector Craddock arrived at the vicarage carrying a telegram from London, his expression bearing the satisfaction of a man whose methodical approach had finally yielded concrete results. Miss Marple, who had arranged to assist with memorial service preparations, found herself positioned to observe the unfolding drama with her characteristic blend of gentle concern and sharp attention. Langstone and Archer have sent their preliminary findings, Inspector Craddock announced to Reverend Clement, who received the news with visible apprehension. Mrs. Croft's documentation was quite thorough. They've discovered significant irregularities in the Searle Trust disbursements over the past 18 months. He consulted his notebook with professional precision. Nearly £3,000 distributed without proper authorization, all to a recipient identified only by the initials CF. Miss Marple observed Clara's reaction to this revelation with particular interest. The young woman's face went ashen, and her hands stilled completely on the flower arrangement she had been preparing. The initials clearly pointed to Clara Finch, and the sum involved was substantial enough to destroy both her uncle's career and her own future prospects. Reverend Clement's response confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. The money was used for Clara's musical education, he admitted quietly, his pastoral composure cracking under the weight of exposure. She has extraordinary talent, but my stipend could never have covered the cost of proper training in London. I told myself it was what Miss Searle would have wanted, fostering musical promise among parish youth. This confession provided the crucial motive that had been missing from the investigation. Clara's future as a musician, her uncle's reputation and livelihood, and the family's entire way of life had all been threatened by Mrs. Croft's discovery. The choir mistress's rigid adherence to rules and her documented intention to expose the irregularities had created a situation desperate enough to drive someone to murder. As Inspector Craddock continued his questioning, Miss Marple engaged Clara in seemingly casual conversation about the memorial arrangements. Her approach was gentle but methodical, each observation carefully calculated to increase psychological pressure while maintaining the appearance of innocent concern. "Such beautiful chrysanthemums you've arranged," Miss Marple observed, noting how Clara's movements became increasingly agitated. Mrs. Hartley mentioned that 2 of her carefully placed blooms went missing from the church decorations. Such distinctive flowers with their particular pollen that clings so readily to clothing. She paused, allowing the implication to settle. I noticed some on the flagstones near where poor Mrs. Croft was found, quite out of place among the harvest arrangements. Clara's flush was immediate and telling. Her hands trembled as she continued working with the flowers, and Miss Marple noticed how she unconsciously pulled her sleeve down to cover the faint red line still visible on her wrist. The conversation was interrupted by Amos Reed's arrival with disturbing news. During his morning cleaning of the church, he had discovered that the vestry had been searched again during the night. Mrs. Croft's remaining papers had been scattered, and someone had attempted to burn documents in the old iron stove, though the poor draught had caused them to abandon the effort and try drowning the evidence instead. Inspector Craddock's examination of the scene revealed charred fragments in a biscuit tin hidden beneath the choir stalls. Miss Marple assisted in carefully separating the damaged papers, her steady hands and keen eyes proving invaluable in recovering crucial evidence. Among the fragments were clear references to Searle Trust recipient CF and partial documentation of the unauthorized disbursements. "Someone has been very busy trying to eliminate evidence," Inspector Craddock observed grimly. "The same person who wrote those threatening notes, I suspect, using the same careful block letters we've seen before." Miss Marple's examination of the scene yielded additional insights. She noticed the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the vestry, though neither Amos nor the inspector smoked. More significantly, she discovered a small thread caught on the splintered drawer where Mrs. Croft's correspondence had been kept, black wool of the type used in clerical garments, with a greasy smear that suggested contact with pipe ash. As the evidence accumulated, Clara's composure began to deteriorate visibly. When Miss Marple casually mentioned finding a collar stud in Mrs. Croft's cottage, the young woman's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the table as if seeking physical support. "Such a small thing," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "but quite out of place in a house where no gentleman regularly visited. The kind of thing that might be lost during a hurried departure, perhaps when someone was trying to search for important papers." The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Clara's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and her eyes darted constantly between her uncle and the door as if calculating escape routes. Miss Marple recognized the signs of someone whose carefully maintained deception was finally crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence and guilt. Reverend Clement, observing his niece's distress with growing alarm, attempted to intervene. "Clara has been under tremendous strain since Mrs. Croft's death," he said, his voice carrying the protective authority of both uncle and pastor. "Perhaps these questions could wait until she's feeling more composed." But Miss Marple had learned to recognize the critical moment when psychological pressure reaches its breaking point. Clara's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and her careful composure had given way to barely suppressed panic. The young woman's eyes held the desperate look of someone who knows their secrets are about to be exposed, who understands that the careful web of deception they have constructed is finally unraveling beyond repair. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles clicking with soothing rhythm, "that Clara has something she wishes to tell us. Don't you, my dear? Sometimes the burden of carrying secrets becomes too heavy for even the strongest shoulders." Clara looked up at Miss Marple with eyes that held both terror and relief, the expression of someone who has been drowning and finally sees the possibility of rescue, even if it means facing terrible consequences. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, pregnant with the promise of revelation and the terrible weight of truth finally demanding its due. In the silence that followed, the bells of St. Bartholomew's remained still in their tower, waiting for the moment when honesty would allow them to ring pure and true once more. Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, patient as always, understanding that the final act of this tragic drama was about to begin. The words came slowly at first, as if Clara were testing each one for its weight before allowing it to escape. "I wrote the notes," she whispered, her hands twisting the hymn book ribbon until it left angry red marks on her fingers. "The ones telling Inspector Craddock to stop investigating, to let it be an accident. I thought if everyone would just accept what happened, if they would stop asking questions." Her voice trailed off into the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm, providing a soothing counterpoint to the terrible tension that filled the vicarage sitting room. "Of course you did, my dear," she said with the same tone she might have used to discuss a recipe for seed cake. "The block letters were quite carefully done, but certain habits persist despite our best efforts to disguise them. The way you close your G's, the little hook at the end of your R's, identical to the labels on the children's hymn folders you prepared last month." Clara's flush deepened, but Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Reverend Clement, who stood frozen by the window with his unlit pipe clutched in hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The pastoral serenity that had always defined his public presence was cracking like old paint, revealing something far more human and desperate beneath. "But writing anonymous letters is quite different from what happened to Mrs. Croft," Miss Marple continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "That required someone with intimate knowledge of the church, someone who could move through those sacred spaces without drawing attention, someone who possessed the keys to areas normally kept locked." Inspector Craddock, who had learned to recognize the signs of Miss Marple's methodical approach, remained silent and watchful. The evidence they had gathered over the past few days lay between them like pieces of a puzzle, finally ready to be assembled. Mrs. Croft had discovered the irregularities in the Searle Trust, hadn't she, Reverend? Miss Marple asked gently. The unauthorized disbursements for Clara's musical education, nearly £3,000 over 18 months, according to the London solicitors. A substantial sum that would have provided Clara with opportunities far beyond what your stipend could afford. Reverend Clement's pipe slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the flagstone hearth. "Clara's talent is extraordinary," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She deserved every opportunity to develop it. Miss Searle's trust was meant for exactly that purpose, fostering musical promise among parish youth. But Mrs. Croft saw it differently," Miss Marple observed, her keen eyes noting how Clara had gone pale at her uncle's words. "She was a woman of rigid principles, wasn't she? Rules were rules, procedures were procedures, and she had no patience for creative interpretations of legal documents." The silence that followed was broken by Clara's barely audible sob. "She said terrible things about Uncle," the young woman whispered. "Called him a thief hiding behind a clerical collar, said she would see him defrocked and imprisoned." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to weave together the threads of evidence they had so carefully gathered. Mrs. Croft arranged to meet someone after evensong by the bell tower steps. We found the torn note in her cottage, after evensong by the west stair. "Come alone." The handwriting was disguised, but not well enough to hide its true author. She looked directly at Clara, her expression infinitely kind but absolutely implacable. "You wrote that note, didn't you, my dear? You arranged the meeting, hoping to reason with her, to buy time for your uncle to make things right with the trust." Clara's composure finally cracked completely. "I only wanted to explain," she said through her tears. "To make her understand that Uncle wasn't a criminal, that the money was being used exactly as Miss Searle intended. But she wouldn't listen. She grabbed my wrist and said she was going straight to the police." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose careful deductions were proving correct. "That explains the pressure bruise Dr. Haydock found on Mrs. Croft's wrist and the corresponding scratch on yours. But you didn't kill her, did you, Clara? You ran back to the parish hall, frightened and ashamed." "I told Uncle what had happened," Clara whispered. "He said he would handle it, that I shouldn't worry. He went out to the church to pray, he said, but when he came back... She looked at her uncle with eyes full of terrible knowledge. His sleeve was smudged with ash, and there were yellow chrysanthemum petals on his coat. All eyes turned to Reverend Clement, who seemed to age a decade in the space of a heartbeat. His shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled upon them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of a man whose world was collapsing around him. "I found her by the bell tower steps," he said quietly. "She was in a rage, more furious than I had ever seen her. She said she was going to ring the bells to summon help, to have me arrested immediately." His hands shook as he continued. "I tried to reason with her, to explain about Clara's future, about how the trust money was being used for its intended purpose, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying I had betrayed my calling, that I was a common thief." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words cut through the room like a blade. "And then, Reverend?" "She pushed past me toward the tower steps," Reverend Clement whispered. "I grabbed her arm to stop her, and she turned around so quickly, so angrily. There was a moment when we struggled, and then..." His voice broke completely. "She struck her head on the stone step when she fell. There was so much blood." The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Miss Marple continued her methodical reconstruction, each detail falling into place with terrible precision. "But you didn't summon help, did you, Reverend? Instead, you staged the scene to look like an accident. You retrieved Mrs. Croft's conductor's baton from the choir stalls, where Amos had seen it after the service. You broke it and placed it beside her body to suggest she had been carrying it when she fell. You opened the bell tower door with your key and left it ajar to imply she had gone up alone." Inspector Craddock had been taking careful notes throughout the confession, but Miss Marple sensed there were still details that needed clarification. "The chrysanthemum petals were the first clue," she continued. "2 whole blooms had been taken from Mrs. Hartley's carefully arranged decorations. You had been working in the vicarage garden that day, Clara, and the pollen clung to your clothing. When you knelt beside Mrs. Croft's body, trying to help or simply in your panic, those petals fell." Clara nodded miserably, unable to speak. "And then came the systematic attempt to destroy evidence," Miss Marple said, addressing Reverend Clement directly. "The searches of Mrs. Croft's cottage and the church vestry, the attempts to burn documents in the old stove. You left traces everywhere. Pipe tobacco scent in places where no one smoked, a collar stud lost during a hurried search, even threads from your clerical garments caught on splintered wood." Reverend Clement buried his face in his hands, his body racked with silent sobs. "I never meant for her to die," he whispered. "I only wanted to protect Clara, to preserve her future. But once it happened, once she was gone, I couldn't see any way forward except to hide the truth." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with the finality of a man whose investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion. "Reverend Clement Finch, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Eleanor Croft. Clara Finch, you'll need to come with us as well for questioning regarding your role in concealing evidence and obstructing justice." As the terrible scene played out, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of it all. The very qualities that had made Reverend Clement a beloved pastor, his protective love for his niece, his desire to nurture talent and provide opportunities, had ultimately led him to violence when those same qualities were threatened. Mrs. Croft's rigid adherence to rules and procedures, admirable in its way, had created a situation where compromise seemed impossible and desperate action inevitable. The bells of St. Bartholomew's remained silent in their tower, but Miss Marple knew their silence would not last forever. Truth, once revealed, had a way of demanding its own justice, and the village of Little Wickham would need time to heal from the wounds that secrets and deception had inflicted upon its peaceful community. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a final counterpoint to the scene as Clara and her uncle were led away. 2 lives destroyed by a moment of anger and the terrible choices that followed in its wake. The silence that settled over Little Wickham in the wake of the arrests was not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful village, but the heavy stillness that follows revelation of terrible truths. Miss Marple, walking through the lanes in the days that followed, observed how conversation ceased when she approached, then resumed in hushed tones once she had passed. The village was struggling to reconcile the gentle pastor they had known with the desperate man who had committed violence in a moment of protective fury, and the talented young woman they had watched grow up with someone who had helped conceal murder. Inspector Craddock returned to tie up the remaining threads of evidence with his characteristic thoroughness. The collar stud found in Mrs. Croft's cottage was confirmed as belonging to Reverend Clement's clerical set, one piece missing from the velvet-lined box in his bedroom. The beeswax residue on the bell tower steps matched exactly the polish used on the choir furniture, confirming that Mrs. Croft's baton had been deliberately placed there after being retrieved from its proper location. Most damning of all, the ash fragments recovered from the vestry stove contained traces of the specific tobacco blend that Reverend Clement favored for his rarely used pipe. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the full complexity of the tragedy. Reverend Clement's defense argued for manslaughter rather than murder, emphasizing that Mrs. Croft's death had resulted from a struggle rather than premeditated violence. The prosecution, while acknowledging the tragic circumstances, pointed to the systematic attempts to destroy evidence and mislead the investigation as proof of calculated deception following the initial act. Miss Marple, called upon to testify, spoke with quiet authority about her observations and deductions. In the witness box, she explained how small details had accumulated into an undeniable pattern: the significance of displaced chrysanthemum petals, the implications of a conductor's baton moved from its proper place, and the human psychology that drove people to desperate acts when their deepest loyalties were threatened. "I have observed," she told the court in her gentle voice, "that people often reveal their true nature not in moments of calm deliberation, but in times of crisis when their fundamental values are challenged." Reverend Clement's actions, while inexcusable, arose from his protective love for his niece rather than from malice or greed. Clara's role proved more complex than initially apparent. Her attempts to protect her uncle through anonymous letters and her participation in destroying evidence made her an accessory after the fact, though her eventual cooperation with the investigation earned consideration from the court. The young woman's genuine remorse was evident to all who observed her throughout the proceedings. The resolution of the Searle Trust became a matter of considerable legal complexity. Clara's musical education, funded through unauthorized disbursements, had genuinely fulfilled the Trust's stated purpose, even though proper procedures had not been followed. The London solicitors, working with Dr. Haydock as the surviving trustee, eventually established new oversight procedures while allowing Clara to complete her studies under much stricter supervision. Timothy Fletcher, whose testimony about the angry voices he had overheard proved crucial to establishing the timeline of events, struggled with guilt over not intervening when he might have prevented tragedy. Miss Marple, encountering him outside the post office several weeks after the trial, offered the gentle wisdom that had comforted many troubled souls over the years. "We cannot know what might have been, my dear," she told him as they stood in the autumn sunlight. "The burden of what if is too heavy for any one person to carry. Mrs. Croft's death was the result of choices made by others, not by your decision to avoid confrontation." As winter settled over Little Wickham, the village began to find its new equilibrium. A temporary pastor was appointed while the diocese considered long-term arrangements, and the choir struggled to maintain its musical standards without Mrs. Croft's demanding leadership. Amos Reed, the faithful verger, took on additional responsibilities, his simple devotion to duty providing stability during the difficult transition. The bell tower, scene of the tragic confrontation, remained locked for several months while new safety measures were installed. When the bells finally rang again on Christmas morning, their bronze voices carried across the countryside with renewed clarity. though Miss Marple, hearing them from her cottage garden, detected a faint, melancholy echo that would always remind her of the tragedy that had stained those ancient stones. The community's healing was gradual, but genuine. People began to understand that tragedy had revealed not the presence of evil among them, but the terrible complexity of human nature. How love could drive people to desperate acts, how rigid principles could create impossible situations, and how good intentions could lead to devastating consequences. Miss Marple, settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the short winter days drew in, reflected on the eternal puzzle of human nature. Mrs. Croft's rigid adherence to rules and procedures, admirable in its way, had created an inflexible situation where compassion might have found a different solution. Reverend Clement's protective love for his niece, the very quality that had made him beloved by his parishioners, had ultimately led him to violence when that love was threatened. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing rhythm as she contemplated how the same qualities that made people admirable could, under sufficient pressure, lead them to tragedy. In her long experience with such matters, she had learned that understanding was often more valuable than judgment, and that the capacity for both good and evil existed within every human heart. The investigation had revealed not just the facts of a crime, but the complex web of relationships and loyalties that bound a community together. It had shown how secrets, even those kept from the kindest motives, could fester and grow until they demanded terrible prices from those who carried them. As spring returned to Little Wickham, bringing with it the promise of renewal and fresh beginnings, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the community was slowly healing from its wounds. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang pure and clear once more, carrying their ancient message of hope across the peaceful countryside, where human dramas continued to play out their eternal patterns of love, loss, and redemption. In her garden, the chrysanthemums bloomed again, their golden faces turned toward the sun, and Miss Marple smiled to think that even the most tragic events could not forever dim the simple beauty of flowers reaching toward the light. The murder beneath the choir bells had taught them all profound lessons about human nature, but it had also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of communities bound together by genuine care and mutual forgiveness. Life, in all its complexity and contradiction, would continue in Little Wickham, richer perhaps for having confronted its own capacity for both darkness and grace. The weeks following the trial brought to Little Wickham the particular kind of quiet that settles over a community when it has been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Miss Marple, making her customary morning rounds, observed how conversations carried a new weight, how glances lingered with deeper consideration, as if the villagers were seeing each other clearly for the first time. The tragedy had stripped away comfortable assumptions about human nature, revealing the complex motivations that could drive even the gentlest souls to desperate acts. Dr. Haydock had thrown himself into reorganizing the Searle Trust with the dedication of a man seeking redemption through service. Miss Marple encountered him outside the post office one morning, carrying a leather portfolio thick with correspondence from the London solicitors. His face bore the lines of someone who had learned that good intentions without proper oversight could lead to devastating consequences. "We're establishing clear procedures this time," he explained, his voice carrying both determination and humility. "Proper applications, transparent review processes, regular audits." Clara's case proved that Miss Searle's vision was sound. There are young people in our parish with genuine talent who deserve opportunities. Perhaps if we had created proper channels before, if we had been more attentive to such needs, the whole terrible business might have been avoided. The new vicar, Reverend Thornley, brought with him a more direct approach to pastoral care that differed markedly from his predecessor's gentle, scholarly manner. His emphasis on community engagement and practical support for struggling families suggested lessons learned from the tragedy that had befallen his predecessor. Miss Marple noted how the congregation gradually warmed to his forthright style, though certain older members still glanced toward the vicarage with expressions of profound loss. Timothy Fletcher's return from his London studies marked another milestone in the village's healing process. The young man had completed his musical education with assistance from the newly reorganized trust, and his homecoming brought news that Clara would soon be released, her sentence reduced for cooperation and genuine remorse. His patient work with the church choir during her absence had impressed even the most critical observers, and his dedication to maintaining Mrs. Croft's exacting standards suggested that something valuable had survived the tragedy. The announcement of Clara's impending return stirred mixed reactions throughout the village. At Mullin's grocery, Mrs. Price expressed the view that some things are better left buried. Yet Miss Marple noticed that the same woman had quietly contributed to a collection being organized to help Clara re-establish herself. It was, she reflected, a perfect example of how human nature could surprise even the most cynical observers with its capacity for unexpected grace. When Clara finally did return, thin and subdued but carrying herself with a dignity born of genuine remorse, the village's response revealed how much it had learned about forgiveness without forgetting. She took lodgings with Mrs. Weatherby, whose practical kindness provided exactly the kind of structured support that someone rebuilding their life required. The young woman's first appearance at Sunday service created a moment of collective held breath, but when she took her place in a back pew, not in the choir, not yet, perhaps not ever, the congregation's quiet acceptance spoke volumes about the community's growth in wisdom and compassion. Amos Reed, the faithful verger, had emerged from the crisis with his simple dignity intact and his devotion to the church undiminished. His methodical care of the building provided continuity during the difficult transition, and his gentle manner with visitors had made him an unofficial guardian of the church's reputation. Miss Marple often found him polishing brass or arranging flowers with the same reverent attention he had always shown, as if his faithful service could somehow heal the wounds that violence had inflicted upon the sacred space. The bell tower itself had been thoroughly cleaned and rededicated, with new safety procedures instituted by Reverend Thornley. The bells, after months of careful silence, had gradually resumed their ancient rhythm, though Miss Marple detected a new solemnity in their bronze voices, as if they too remembered what had transpired beneath their watch. Their sound carried across the countryside with renewed clarity, but also with a deeper resonance that spoke of hard-won wisdom. On a particularly fine morning in late spring, Miss Marple paused in her garden to admire the chrysanthemums that had begun their annual emergence. These flowers, once symbols of evidence and guilt, had been transformed by time and understanding into something more hopeful. Reminders that beauty could emerge even from the darkest circumstances, that renewal was always possible for those willing to tend their gardens with patience and care. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure at her garden gate. Clara stood there uncertainly, carrying a small wrapped package, her face bearing the particular expression of someone who has something difficult but necessary to say. "Miss Marple," she began quietly, "I wanted to thank you for your kindness during the trial, and for understanding what Uncle was trying to protect." She held out the package with hands that trembled only slightly. "I've been working on this. A small composition for piano and voice. I thought perhaps, if the church council agrees, it might be appropriate for next year's memorial service for Mrs. Croft." Miss Marple accepted the gift with the gentle grace that had comforted so many troubled souls over the years. Inside was a handwritten musical score titled "Beneath the Bells," a piece that managed to be both mournful and hopeful, acknowledging loss while celebrating the possibility of redemption. "Music," Clara continued, "was what started all the trouble, but it's also what I hope might help heal some of the wounds." Mrs. Croft always said that true artistry required honesty, even when honesty was painful. I think she would have appreciated that. As autumn deepened and the anniversary of Mrs. Croft's death approached, the village made its final peace with the tragedy through the dedication of a small memorial garden beside the church. The space featured chrysanthemums in golden profusion, their faces turned toward the light, transforming symbols of violence into reminders of beauty's persistence. A simple plaque bore Mrs. Croft's name and dates, along with a line from her favorite anthem, "For the beauty of the earth, for the glory of the skies." Miss Marple, attending the dedication ceremony with her knitting bag and her characteristic quiet attention, reflected on how completely the community had been changed by the events of that terrible evening. The investigation had revealed not just the facts of a crime, but the intricate web of loyalties, fears, and aspirations that motivated every human heart. People spoke more carefully now, listened more attentively, and showed greater patience with the struggles that others faced in private. As she walked home through the village lanes that evening, the gentle chime of the church bells marking the hour, Miss Marple considered the eternal puzzle of human nature. Mrs. Croft's rigid adherence to principle, admirable in its way, had created an inflexible situation where compromise might have found a different solution. Reverend Clement's protective love for his niece, the very quality that had made him beloved by his parishioners, had ultimately driven him to violence when that love was threatened. Yet from this painful knowledge had emerged a deeper understanding of the complexities that defined human relationships and a greater appreciation for the fragile bonds that held communities together. The murder beneath the choir bells had taught Little Wickham profound lessons about the capacity for both darkness and redemption that existed within every human soul, and the community was stronger for having learned to acknowledge both with equal honesty and compassion. Settling into her favorite chair as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple picked up her knitting and allowed the familiar rhythm of the needles to soothe her thoughts. Outside her window, the late autumn light illuminated a world that seemed somehow more precious for having been touched by tragedy and transformed by understanding. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang their final call of the day, their bronze voices carrying across the peaceful countryside where human dramas would continue to play out their eternal patterns of love, loss, and redemption. In her garden, the chrysanthemums bloomed in golden splendor, their faces turned toward the dying light, and Miss Marple smiled to think that even the most tragic events could not forever dim the simple beauty of flowers, reaching toward hope. The murder beneath the choir bells had ended, but the lessons it taught about human nature, fragile, complex, and ultimately capable of grace, would endure as long as people gathered in communities and struggled to understand the mysterious workings of the human heart. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a final counterpoint to her reflections as Little Wickham settled into evening peace, richer perhaps for having confronted its own capacity for both darkness and light, and wiser for having learned that justice and mercy, properly balanced, could indeed ring as true as the ancient bells that watched over them all. The first anniversary of Mrs. Eleanor Croft's death arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that transformed Little Wickham into a watercolor painting of russet leaves and golden light. Miss Marple, making her way to the memorial service with her customary measured pace, reflected on how completely the village had been transformed by the events of that terrible evening when violence had shattered their peaceful world. The investigation that followed had revealed not just the facts of a crime, but the intricate web of human loyalties, fears, and aspirations that motivated every heart in their small community. The church was fuller than it had been for any service since the tragedy itself. Clara sat in the third row, her posture straight but humble, beside Timothy Fletcher, whose steady presence had anchored her through the difficult months of rebuilding her life. Reverend Thornley conducted the memorial with appropriate solemnity, but his words carried undertones of hope that would have been impossible in the immediate aftermath of Mrs. Croft's death. After the service, as the congregation gathered in the memorial garden where golden chrysanthemums bloomed in careful profusion, Miss Marple found herself approached by Inspector Craddock, who had made the journey from Much Benham for the occasion. His presence was both professional courtesy and personal recognition of how the case had challenged his usual methodical approach to criminal investigation. "I should like it, Miss Marple," he began, settling where she indicated near the memorial plaque, "if you would tell me, in your own way, precisely how you knew. For my report, yes, but also for my peace of mind. One hears of instinct, but what you possess does not feel like that. It feels like the thing we policemen claim is ours. A chain of particulars." Miss Marple smiled gently, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. "Instinct, Inspector, is only memory catalogued under the wrong label. One notices the same sorts of things in different circumstances. The first and smallest clue was that chrysanthemum petal, bright yellow where it had no business being among Mrs. Hartley's carefully arranged harvest decorations. Then Timothy mentioned Mrs. Croft's fear of heights, which struck me as significant. A woman who would not mount a step-ladder would hardly venture up those narrow stone steps on a dim evening, conductor's baton in hand. Inspector Craddock nodded thoughtfully. The petal and the fear of heights. "And the way she lay," Miss Marple continued mildly. "Dr. Haydock's examination was quite revealing when he found no defensive injuries, no scuffed palms, no bloodied knees from tumbling down unforgiving stone, only that decisive blow to the temple and the pressure mark upon her wrist. One does not fall neatly down ancient steps. One is positioned there, if you see what I mean, by hands that hold, however briefly. Combined with Amos's clear recollection that the baton sat properly in its choir, stand after evensong, and that little crescent of beeswax on the third step, a resting place not where something would land from a fall, it became clear someone had staged the entire scene." The inspector exhaled slowly, the way practical men do when they must acknowledge what they had hoped not to see. "And the bell tower door." "Precisely. Not forced open, but unlocked with a proper key," Miss Marple observed, folding a neat row on her needles. "Such a narrowing little fact. Only 3 people possessed those keys: the verger, the vicar, and the treasurer. Poor Mr. Pemberton's nervousness, while genuine, was of the moral rather than murderous variety. He had promised Mrs. Croft to confess his irregularities himself. People who have resolved to be caught do not generally begin forcing locks and scattering papers. Besides, Mrs. Croft's correspondence with the London solicitors made his guilt rather inconvenient. Once Langstone and Archer had received her documents, removing Mrs. Croft would only delay, not prevent, the eventual investigation. Inspector Craddock accepted this reasoning with a rueful expression. "You suspected the vicar quite early, then?" "Suspected, not convicted," she corrected gently. The pipe tobacco scent in Mrs. Croft's cottage, where no one was known to smoke, was telling. So was that collar stud caught in her skirting board, and the smear of ash where none should have been. I had noticed earlier the dusting of yellow chrysanthemum pollen on Reverend Clement's coat cuff. Such pollen clings faithfully to fabric. And later, black clerical wool snagged on the splintered drawer he himself claimed had been vandalized by intruders. It is often in the small acts of concealment that people reveal themselves most clearly. And Clara's role. "Poor child," Miss Marple said softly, watching as Clara and Timothy worked together to arrange fresh flowers around the memorial stone. She wrote those desperate notes, "Accident, let it be," in block letters that tried too hard to disguise her natural hand. Those closed G's, those distinctive hooked R's, were identical to her careful lettering on the children's hymn folders. She had arranged the fatal meeting with that forged summons. "After evensong by the west stair. Come alone, hoping to plead for time, for mercy." But Mrs. Croft was not a woman inclined toward mercy. When she gripped Clara's wrist and promised the most rigid of remedies, The girl ran to the one person she believed could bear any burden for her sake. "Reverend Clement," Inspector Craddock said quietly, "who went intending to reason and found himself in a struggle that ended in tragedy," Miss Marple confirmed simply. Afterward came the desperate attempts at concealment, opening the tower door with his key, moving and breaking the baton to create the appearance of an accident, later searching and burning documents because once a person tells one lie to cover a dreadful moment, they must tell many more to protect that first deception. As their conversation concluded and the memorial gathering gradually dispersed, Miss Marple observed the remarkable transformation that had taken place in their small community. Dr. Haydock had thrown himself into reforming the Searle Trust with meticulous transparency, ensuring that Clara and other talented young people could receive proper support through legitimate channels. Clara herself had been accepted to continue her musical education at the Royal Academy, her talent now channeled through proper procedures that honored both Miss Searle's original intentions and Mrs. Croft's insistence on accountability. The afternoon's most moving moment came when Reverend Thornley announced that Clara would perform a new composition written specifically for Mrs. Croft's memorial. The young woman rose from her back pew with quiet dignity and walked to the small harmonium, her hands trembling only once before finding the keys. Beneath the bells carried no dramatic flourishes or complex harmonies. Instead, it moved with the inevitability of walking home at dusk, the melody rising where it must and yielding where it should. The piece held, in its careful phrases, both the sternness of a woman who believed rules were humanity's only safe bridge across folly, and in its closing cadence, the forgiveness that sometimes awaits us when we have fallen into deeper waters than we intended. People wept who had not wept in months, finding in Clara's music both acknowledgement of loss and promise of redemption. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her way home through lanes that seemed somehow more precious for having been touched by tragedy and transformed by understanding. The bells of St. Bartholomew's chimed the hour, with voices that carried both sorrow and hope across the peaceful countryside, their bronze tones deeper and more resonant than before, as if they had learned something profound about the human capacity for both darkness and grace. Settling into her favorite chair as twilight gathered, Miss Marple picked up her knitting and allowed the familiar rhythm of the needles to guide her final reflections on the case. The murder beneath the choir bells had begun with the most admirable of intentions, an uncle's desire to provide opportunities for his gifted niece, a young woman's gratitude and loyalty, even Mrs. Croft's rigid insistence on proper procedures. Yet those same virtuous impulses, when combined with fear, pride, and the failure of honest communication, had led inexorably to violence and heartbreak. The resolution had required not merely the revelation of facts, but the patient untangling of human motivations and the careful reconstruction of emotional truths. Each small detail, from displaced flower petals to handwriting characteristics, from pressure bruises to pipe tobacco scents, had contributed to a larger understanding of how ordinary people could find themselves capable of extraordinary acts when pushed beyond their capacity for endurance. Most significantly, the case had demonstrated that justice and mercy were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same fundamental truth about human nature. The community's response had shown that forgiveness without forgetting was indeed possible, that people could acknowledge terrible mistakes while still choosing to believe in the possibility of redemption and renewal. Outside her window, the chrysanthemums in the memorial garden caught the last light of day, their golden faces turned toward tomorrow's promise. Miss Marple smiled to think that even the most tragic events could not forever dim the essential goodness that bound communities together, the persistent human capacity for growth and understanding that made her peculiar, calling both necessary and ultimately hopeful. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as Little Wickham settled into evening peace. The murder beneath the choir bells had ended, but the wisdom it had brought would endure as long as people gathered in communities and struggled to comprehend the mysterious workings of the human heart. In that understanding lay both the challenge and the reward of observing human nature in all its fascinating, troubling, and ultimately redemptive complexity. As the church bells fell silent and darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple continued her knitting, content in the knowledge that truth had been revealed, justice had been served with compassion, and a community had been strengthened by its willingness to confront both its failures and its capacity for grace. The ancient rhythm of life in Little Wickham would continue, richer perhaps for having learned that even beneath the darkest shadows, the human heart remained always capable of returning to the light.